So I'd like to introduce Tabitha Hyrnick from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. And she's going to talk today about pandemics and the politics of knowledge.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm Tabitha Hyrnick. I am a early career, I guess, a social science researcher based at the Institute of Development Studies, here to present research that colleagues and I undertook from late 2021 to early 2022, a few months after COVID-19 vaccinations had become available to 12 to 15-year-olds in the UK. And at the time, uptake among youth was lagging hopes and expectations. So our research explored what may have been underlying this lower than expected uptake and how local policy and health actors could better engage young people around not only vaccine uptake, but generally improving health and well-being for youth in the pandemic context, but also beyond. So my colleagues and I decided to title our presentation Pandemics and the Politics of Knowledge, because the approach that we took was very much one of prioritizing the voices of young people and indeed their meaningful participation and even leadership in the research. The perspectives, experiences, and knowledge of young people, particularly marginalized young people, are typically excluded from research and certainly from policy and decision-making processes. And so by centering them and spotlighting their value through a qualitative social science approach, we together challenged conventional hierarchies of knowledge with respect to what or whose knowledge is typically considered relevant to addressing pandemic problems like low vaccine uptake. So before I talk about this specific research project, however, I just want to mention that it is part of a broader body of work, which began with engagement between the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform, of which my colleagues and I are a part, and the public health team based in Ealing Council. Ealing is a borough in northwest London. Its population is highly racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse, speaking a great many languages, practicing many religions, having a rich history of anti-racist organizing. There are many migrant communities and also, as in many urban areas, many pockets of social and economic deprivation. In the council's initial approach to our project, they were concerned about disparities in COVID-19 vaccine uptake between different racially and ethnically minoritized groups and along the socioeconomic gradient, and indeed later on among youth. So in partnership with our colleagues in public health and also with community actors, our approach has been to support a shift away from a framing of vaccine hesitance, which tends to focus on individuals and the misinformation or knowledge they may have and the individual decisions they may make, to a broader framing of health equity, which emphasizes the broader social, historical, and health contexts which influence vaccine accessibility, confidence, and decision-making. We know now that simply attending to the information landscape, as perhaps may be assumed by maybe infodemic management, sort of emerging field, is not sufficient for changing hearts and minds, let alone for achieving accessibility for all. And this shift requires diverse forms of knowledge, including about historic, social, cultural, economic, and political dynamics, including socioeconomic and racial inequalities, as well as the perspectives, experiences, and priorities of communities typically excluded, again, from research, from policy discussions, and decision-making in the context of pandemics. The particular piece of work I'm talking about focuses on youth in two contexts: Cleveland, Ohio in the United States, and in Ealing. I'm only going to be talking about Ealing today. That's the bit of the research that I was involved in. But we do also have content and research on our Ealing case study. So what did we do? The work was based, as I mentioned before, on a qualitative case study methodology, which employed both participatory and traditional methods. Our traditional methods included in-depth interviews with young people between the ages of 12 and 18, as well as in-depth focus group discussions. The participatory element of this project was based on a youth participatory action, or YPAR, methodology. This involved recruiting and engaging a youth advisory board made up of 5 young people identified by our partners in youth services and recruited through snowballing techniques. and also engaging with youth through other informal activities, such as hanging out with young people in a local youth center. YPAR involves youth as active participants in the research process, and the advisory board participated in and helped to steer the research, including by engaging in active reflection on their own experiences and priorities and considering them in the context of other project data, such as the themes emerging from interviews and focus groups, and also engaging in collaborative analysis through discussion with the researchers. Our project also worked closely with, as I mentioned, policy actors, particularly in the public health team in the local authority, also with council youth services and with voluntary in the community sector. And this engagement included periodic discussions to inform public health activities, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. So what did we find? We found that about half the youth that we engaged were unvaccinated, which was consistent with borough level statistics at the time. There were also, borough statistics also reflected a 20% percentage gap disparity between the neighborhoods with the highest level of youth uptake and lowest. In our data, this was even a bigger gap, with 71% of youth in one area with greater levels of deprivation being unvaccinated, compared with only 12% being unvaccinated in another. In addition to location, older age, being from a racially or ethnically minoritized background, experiencing deprivation, and having family or friends that were also unvaccinated were related to being unvaccinated in our own data. But the real strength of our research and this type of research isn't so much about the numbers and the correlations, but in illuminating the nuances of the drivers behind non-uptake. So focusing on those who were unvaccinated, their reasons ranged from very complex to quite passive. Some cited concerns about safety, rushed testing, stories of adverse events, and perceived coercion, while others just did not perceive themselves to be at risk. The young people linked this to mistrust, and linked their or other young people's mistrust in the short term to having been felt like they were ignored or even blamed for the spread of COVID-19 in their communities, in narratives. They evidenced over a longer time frame. This mistrust was also perceived in the context of a longer time frame around a perceived lack of investment and interest in youth, evidenced by the young people, for instance, in the defunding of youth centers and other activities and services, as well as experiences of racism, including in schools and in systemic targeting by police, particularly among young men from racialized backgrounds, and also to a deepening sense of displacement, born from, in this particular context, urban regeneration projects that excluded them and their families. Many youth also described other priorities, such as ensuring that they and their families had food and shelter. And they were also very concerned about their uncertain futures. They were worried about access to education, to job training, to work, and other economic opportunities in the context of the pandemic, but also into the future. They spoke about the impacts of the pandemic and these other worries on their mental health and the importance of positive channels for self-expression, such as through arts and music and sports, emerged as a hugely important theme in this research and as a priority for the young people we spoke to. So what does this mean? So I think our findings have implications on two temporal scales. In the more immediate sense, this pointed to a need, again, to move beyond kind of narrow and individualistic framings of vaccine hesitance, which emphasize having the right or wrong information, to more dynamic vaccine communication strategies, which reach youth through trusted channels and interlocutors. We supported and worked with the public health team at this time to design and get funding for a community champions program, which was also informed by previous work we had done with them around vaccine equity more broadly. And also to incorporate a youth champions component to engage, for young people to engage their peers around issues like vaccine uptake, but also other health issues. Another key lesson here is around embedding vaccination alongside other youth priorities. So in the time frame of the pandemic and vaccination, this could mean firstly, finding ways to safely support, bolster, and create services, spaces, and support for youth to address their educational, economic, and mental health concerns, including through engagement with the community and voluntary sector, and potentially using these spaces as entry points to talk about vaccination and make it available. In the context of our project, the youth they conceptualized, designed, and were supported to organize an event that was completely of their own design and speaking to their priorities. They decided to put together an open mic night, which they framed around youth well-being and expression. Then there is the medium to longer term scale, during which we have the opportunity to build trust with marginalized young people, including again through investing in them and in the assets, services, and support that matter to them. Youth centers, for example, emerged as a critical life-saving space for many marginalized youth, despite being few and far between in the UK in the wake of many years of austerity. Bolstering youth mental health and embedding channels for listening and dialogue between young people, local government, health actors, police, and others, and their engagement in local policy and decision-making can also help to build trust and ensure future policies are also tailored to young people's local realities. The youth champions that I mentioned earlier would go on to engage in a program of community peer research, which may yet be further scaled and built upon, and yet another project for which we and our partners in the council are jointly applying for funding. At the same time, Ealing is also pursuing funding to scale up their own in-house research capacity, and that will also incorporate a strong arm of community-led research and co-production, including youth. Ultimately, however, I think this is a case for bolstering equity in a broader sense, to bring about the kinds of conditions that enable trust and partnership, and thus the uptake of vaccines or other health behaviors, rather than, again, a narrow focus on misinformation and potentially blaming or patronizing narratives that this can lead to around vaccine uptake. So I hope this example has illustrated the value that a social science perspective can bring to issues like vaccine uptake and hopefully to pandemics and other health issues more broadly by bringing attention to context and complexity. Social scientific perspectives can challenge wrong assumptions that might throttle or even militate against the kind of progress we need. By centering community knowledge, experience, and perspectives, and by calling attention to the fact that different people and groups have different vulnerabilities and strengths, we can help inform local pandemic response and preparedness policy and action to be more sensitive to local place conditions and diverse population priorities, and to be more equitable in their design and effect, and thus more effective for everyone overall. Thank you very much.